Welcome everyone to this session where you will have an opportunity to discover aspects of how history, heritage, and memory intersect with research, policy, practice, and Canada's official language minority communities. I'm Linda Savoie. Amongst other responsibilities, I'm the official languages champion at Library and Archives Canada, and I will be moderating this most interesting panel today. Before I introduce the panelists, I would like to provide a bit of context to explain how this panel came to be. As most federal government institutions in Canada, Library and Archives Canada does policy development and conducts research. And obviously these activities are guided by multiple institutional objectives and priorities. Most would be common to national libraries and national archives all over the world. However, what we will be discussing today has at its source a driver that was different from what we usually did in those fields. This driver is our legal obligation to take positive measures to support official language minority communities. Those would be English communities in the province of Quebec and French communities elsewhere in Canada. This is an obligation found under Canada's Official Languages Act. This obligation to take positive measures is not defined precisely, which allows departments such as ours much latitude about how to meet it. In our case, we started by creating two networks, one of libraries and the other of archives and historical societies, all of which were operating in official language minority communities in Canada. Amongst the activities of these networks, we examine the importance of memory to the vitality of language minority communities, something that was a major blind spot in policy and quite limited in research. Much work followed, and today I'm very pleased to introduce you to our panelists who bring together today the perspectives of practice, research, policy development, and whom, by the way, have in common that they are either close allies or members of our two networks. So our panelists will present in the following order today. First, my colleague Alain Roy, Senior Policy Advisor and Researcher at Library and Archives Canada, who will present on memory vitality of official language minority communities in Canada, community needs and government policies towards vitality of memory. Next, Lorraine O'Donnell from Concordia University, who will present a people's history of English-speaking Quebec, planning a community-based action research project. Then, Alexandre Chartier of the Société Historique de Saskatchewan, who will speak about a new initiative to engage and mobilize official language minority community memory organizations. And finally, Rebecca Lazarenko from York University, who will present on the memory manifestations of the Edmonton Francophonie, a test of the memory vitality framework. After these four presentations, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and we look forward to interacting with you at that moment. So without further ado, I will now ask Alain Roy to begin with his presentation. Thank you, Alain.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Linda, for your very nice introduction. So I have a presentation, and I'll just set it up. I'll share the screen, and then, okay, and then this one. Okay, so my presentation is about the vitality of memory. In fact, how it's important for these official language minority communities and how it could serve as a conceptual foundation for public policies. And as Linda mentioned, Canada is a federal state. So we have to consider that there are 13 provinces and territories, and its population is very diverse. We have like the Aboriginal, but also a part of it was colonized by France and Great Britain. So the Official Language Act, in fact, was approved in 1969, and it was to support, in fact, those two communities. But in 2005, there was an addition in the Act that provide, in fact, that oblige, that impose, in fact, on Government of Canada institutions to enhance the vitality of this community. So, and this aspect, in fact, is currently under discussion because there's a process now to modernize the Official Language Act. But the question of, as Linda mentioned, the question of memory was like a blind spot in that all the discussion since the 80s. And so, archives, museums, to, in fact, to make the research minority settings, and also how we can like frame it as a public policy issue. So based on an ecosystemic approach of minorities community, it proposed, in fact, the concept of vitality of memory to guide, in fact, future action for memory institution and their policies. So so if we think of a report itself, the report includes first a literature review of the role of memory in vitality, and also all the research that has been done about vitality as well. So it's really like a literature review. Then we have we frame the concept of vitality of memory, including a definition, characteristics, modeling. And also we tried there was a test in a specific site, which is Mayorville in British Columbia. This report is currently available, and you will have the link at the end of the presentation. So to apprehend, in fact, the vitality of memory, you have to define major themes that are discussed in the historical and heritage communities, and to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So those are the main definitions that were used in the report. So we distinguished between historicity, which is the inscription of a community in time, the heritage, which are the traces left by the past, history, which is the knowledge, whether it's like done by academic or by community researchers. The memory includes, in fact, all the manifestations of a community remembrance of the past and the present. And so the vitality of memory is the strength and diversity with which this community is expressed in their real and symbolic space. So from these definitions, we have defined an ecosystem. So because all these pieces are working together to make sure that there is this presence of a past in the community. So how can we define this ecosystem is that all the reminders of the community encompass all those manifestations. For example, you could have a commemorative monument, a book, as well as a piece of a novel, for example, on the same topic, and all of them will work together to make sure that this memory is vivid in the community. So these reminders often interact and affect not only one, but different aspects at the same time. So, and this ecosystem is not done forever, because it incorporates change into collective representation of the past. For example, we integrate women, minorities, decolonization, all of them are relates to this ecosystem and modify it in time. And the strength of this ecosystem is important because it's create a social bond in the community. And all this social bond is activated will make sure that this vitality of memory will be enacted. And so the system itself, we define like three major sectors in which this system is working, as well as different types of activities. so for example, you have the culture, you have history and commemoration, heritage and landscape, where are the main fields? But those three fields have different manifestations, like, for example, and this is like the topic of this table. For example, you have like the historic literary works, whether they are theater or movies, or and also public art, which are the real manifestations of this memory. You have like the synthesis or memorials in history, and as well as monuments and buildings in heritage. Mediation is all this past is mediated in the community. So you have, for example, libraries, exhibitions, museums, archive centers. Activities are in which the community is engaged and in which this past is made active. So you have, for example, literary festivals, historical festival, heritage, and the socialization is to make sure that all the community and networks are involved in that past, in making that past present, in fact. So you have, for example, networks, associations, societies, historical societies, as well as heritage association. So this modeling, if we could apply it to a community, we'll see how this memory is really important in their present. So this is really a short overview of the concept, and the paper was presented, in fact, at various conferences, such as this one. Numerous articles are pending publication. We had also a test between January and May 2021 in Edmonton. So, and the preliminary analysis has proven that this concept is really like something of interest and could be useful for those communities to really implement or develop the vitality of memory. We have this issue recognized also because the Official Language Commissioner recognized the importance of the concept. And as the Act now is under revision and new action plan is under planning, we expect that some recognition may be sought for official support. And also, there is a community involvement sustained by this concept. For example, the setup of ad hoc group of memory, heritage, and historical organization of WLMC, on which Alexandre will talk later on, is like a way also to push forward this agenda for recognition of the role of memory and the memory as a vitality of memory in those communities. So this is the link to obtain the report, and I'm really happy to present it. And if you want to have any question, don't hesitate to contact me. So now, Lorraine, it's your turn.
Hello, I'm Lorraine O'Donnell. I will be speaking about my project called People's History of English Speaking Quebec. Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Alain, for your talks. I will now share my screen. You can see that? I will start my talk by a territorial acknowledgement. Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, is located on unceded Indigenous land. The Ghanaian-Gahaga Nation is recognized as custodian of lands and waters on which I am present today. Chojogi, or Montreal, is a gathering place for many First Nations and home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. And I respect the continued connections in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples at Montreal. I'll be using a couple of acronyms today. So you'll see in my presentation, English Speaking Quebec, ESQ, and QUESCRN, Quebec English-Speaking Communities Research Network, which is a network I run at Concordia University. Today I'll be presenting the introduction, my project plan, its status, some preliminary results, and then a very brief conclusion. As Linda mentioned, English-speaking Quebec is one of the 2 official language minority communities in Canada. It's a linguistic minority in the province of Quebec, which is majority French-speaking. And English-speaking Quebec is in decline. There's a lot of research documenting that. And the decline is due to demographic and institutional factors. Numbers are stable, sometimes going down, depending on the census. And also a little less known history and heritage factors, including low group awareness of its history, sometimes negative historical representations of the group, and possibly low vitality of memory. My colleague Patrick Donovan and I, who work at Questgren at Concordia, have come up with a project trying to address the question of declining vitality of English-speaking Quebec on the basis of our backgrounds, which is as historians. So what we've done is we've developed and started to carry out a project called People's History of English-Speaking Quebec. So very directly, we're conceiving of our project as a way of engaging in community vitality, which is in decline. Drawing on primary and secondary sources, our project will capture voices of ordinary English-speaking Quebecers who worked in community organizations. And the project will do so in order to preserve and share history and promote English-speaking Quebecers' vitality, and also to amend the dominant narrative, which is sometimes, as I mentioned, negative in its representations of English-speaking Quebec. The project has a number of activities. So we're convening an advisory committee, which will be composed of community group members and experts, but particularly community group members who will help shape the project and make it a community-based one. We will and have started reviewing literature. We'll be doing field work, including archives, but particularly conducting interviews and historical activities. We will be developing something I will briefly describe below, called Community Knowledge Open Library, or CKOL, giving presentations like this one and writing up results. So that's the project in a nutshell. This is a bit of jargon, working on projects in a funded context. The outputs of the project will be our online CKOL database, which I'll explain, PowerPoints and publications, but also project outcomes will include partnerships and networks, for example, of the advisory committee I mentioned. Outcomes refers in project language to the long-term positive or, well, of course, positive outcomes or results of the project. In our case, our project will preserve and make available English-speaking Quebec history and heritage. It will enrich scholarly literature, and it is certainly our hope that the English-speaking community of Quebec will gain self-knowledge, vitality, and well-being. So where are we at? If I return to our activity list, here you see it in terms of whether things are simply at the planning stage or what is underway. We have yet to convene our advisory committee. COVID threw a wrench in our works, of course. We have done some literature review. We're developing CKOL. We're giving presentations, and we've started working on a book project. I'll be now turning to some project results. So I'll start with number 2, reviewing literature. We've looked so far at several sets of literature, and I'll talk about three today. First is literature on people's history. Now, probably people at NCPH know a lot more about people's history than I do, particularly Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. But there is a tradition in historiography, or the written record of history, called people's history. And some of the pioneers were A.L. Morton, who is British and wrote A People's History of England. Howard Zinn, as mentioned, who wrote a fabulously popular People's History of the US. And less known to the audience, I'm sure, is Stanley Ryerson, who is a Canadian historian who wrote the books, among his books, those listed here, which have been called People's History. Here's a picture of Zinn. You can see he's addressing an immense crowd. This was speaking against the Vietnam War. Zinn was a public figure, and his book was well read. People's history that we're drawing on for inspiration for our project helped us define our project's focus, which will be on ordinary people as active agents, and ordinary people carrying out collective action in face of challenges. It also helped us define our project purpose, which is positive social change at the community level, which in our case, as mentioned, has to do with hopefully improving knowledge and community vitality. A second set of literature we are starting to engage in is on community organizations. Cheryl Gosselin has written about English-speaking Quebec community organizations. And very interestingly, here are some of what she has found. She's found that English-speaking Quebec community organizations, in her language, negotiate language frontiers because they're English language groups representing English-speaking communities, but working in a majority-minority setting where they are the minority. So they serve as a kind of bridge, as mentioned in the fourth point there, between English-speaking Quebecers and the majority French-speaking population. They do advocacy, lobbying, and language protection work, as well as cultural promotion. And importantly, Cheryl says they craft a space of belonging to Quebec. Here's a, very pixelated image of one of the community groups in Quebec doing cultural promotion of English-speaking Caribbean people. Another writer who we were interested in is Anna Krasinski, and she has focused on the role of women who are at the heart of progressive community activism. Here's a picture of, I know these people, members of an English-speaking community group in the Gaspé region near the Atlantic in Canada, in Quebec. Désirée Rochat, in looking at Black community groups, English and French in Quebec, has found that people, even those who may not be able to read or write, produce knowledge about their own realities and are potential actors of political change. And as an example from English-speaking Quebec, I can turn to Quebec Home and School Association, which continues after decades being very active in addressing politics as it affects the education sector. A third set of literature we've looked at looks at vitality or well-being as it relates to history and heritage. Vitality, which Alain has already mentioned, was defined originally for ethno-linguistic groups as that which makes a group likely to behave as a distinctive and active collective entity. As I already mentioned, factors in declining English-speaking Quebec vitality are demographic, institutional, but also in the realm of history and heritage, including, as mentioned, simplistic and limited historical representations of English-speaking Quebec, specifically in the Quebec Official History Program. It could be, too, that vitality of memory, as Alain already discussed, is low for English-speaking Quebec, and we hope to carry out subsequent research to address that. So how can history and heritage relate to vitality and well-being? What I find very interesting is there's definitely growing recognition that history and heritage activities, including cultural ones touching on history and heritage, provide benefits for well-being and health of populations. In policy, that's clear both in Canada and in European policy, and also in a lot of a growing body of research, which finds that heritage and history activities and interventions, as they're sometimes called, can provide experience of belonging and engagement, and also physical and mental well-being, not just of individuals, but of communities. So this literature, what we're finding is basically a kind of intellectual framework for what community groups are, what they've done, who's active in them, but also how our work fits into, on the one hand, the vitality and well-being literature and that area of social intervention, let us say, and also the historiographical tradition, which, as I mentioned, we're linking our project to people's history historiography. I will now mention very briefly our Community Knowledge Open Library, or CKOL. So I'm turning now from Activity 2, Literature Review, to Activity 4 of our project. And this is the second and last activity I will address very briefly. Community Knowledge Open Library is an online platform that houses and makes available to the public what is called by librarians grey literature, produced by English-speaking community groups of Quebec. Grey literature includes material that's not archival and unique, but nor is it formally published. It's material community groups do, like newsletters, PowerPoints, annual reports, research reports not published, and so on. CKOL now has over 25 partners contributing grey literature to this platform, and online now are over 1,400 resources. We hope to get thousands more in coming years. And CKOL will be an essential source of information for our People's History Project, which, as mentioned, is on the history of community organizations of Quebec. So in conclusion, this is a lot of words on a single slide, but I will just reiterate that our project will draw on primary and secondary sources, including those gathered through CKOL, to develop a wide range of knowledge on English-speaking Quebec. The knowledge will pertain to ordinary individuals, and it will relate to their work in community organizations, including practices, their culture and identity, politics, and contextual aspects, including relations with the state and with the majority population. It will reveal how English-speaking community organizations have been sites of inclusion, diversity, tension, and debate, and instruments of building and asserting ways for English-speaking Quebecers to belong in and contribute to Quebec and Canada. And in so doing, it will foster vitality and knowledge of connections between community, history, heritage, vitality, and well-being, or such is our hope at this early stage. I should mention the project started in 2019, and we expect it to last another 3 or 4 years. We're mulling over some questions, including governance and involvement, including how do we engage with Indigenous populations who speak English but might not identify as so-called English-speaking Quebecers, and also how to negotiate that interesting question of university people working with communities. We also need to get clear definition of what we mean by ordinary people, community group, and English-speaking Quebec. All of these are very open-ended. Please provide project feedback to my colleague Patrick and me, and you can subscribe to our newsletter for updates. I'd like to thank our funder, Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, which sponsors both CKOL and our project. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Linda, Alain, and Lauren for your talk. I share my screen. So first, I would like to acknowledge that I am on unceded Algonquin Iroquois traditional territory and Métis Nation territory. My name is Alexandre Charté. I'm an executive director of the Société historique de la Saskatchewan French Historical Society, and a member of ad hoc group of memory, heritage, and historical organizations in official language minority communities in Canada. I would like to talk about this new group and their context of creation. Today, minority language communities are represented by two groups: the English-speaking population in Quebec and the French-speaking population in all the other provinces and territories in Canada. These communities have a historical presence, but also a vitality that has been present for several centuries. This vitality is maintained through actions and demand in many sectors of human activities, such as the economy, arts, education, but also categories of public, such as parents, youth, elders, and also categories from identity communities like Francescois, Acadian, Franco-Ontarian, etc. In terms of representation, these sectors and public take the form of incorporated organizations, generally associations and cooperatives with a provincial scope. For over 40 years, these organizations have formed a network that are both community-based within their province and sector-based at the national level. This includes national federation groups and alliances, such as the Fédération culturelle canadienne-française, French-Canadian Cultural Federation, or the Quebec Community Newspaper Association. Their role are essential to the promotion of their sector with governments, private and associative partners, and to the stability and growth of member organizations. Within communities, the heritage, history, and memory act in two ways. In the first way, heritage in the sense of scientific practice is developed by committed persons, professional people, usually implemented by incorporated organizations or in universities. In the second way, heritage in the sense of cultural practice receives greater popularity because it's accessible. Within the communities, heritage sector are not valued in the same way and is unknown by the general public. Without going into details, it's important to note that the representations of heritage through organizations and activities is heterogeneous across provinces and regions. Various community models have been formed in each region and province based on their own history. These varieties have influenced the constitutions of OLMC heritage organizations with different functions and roles. For example, there are historical societies in Western and Northern Canada with private archives, while in the Maritime provinces and Quebec, there are community museums and historic sites. However, most of them address similar activities between the preservations of artifacts and archives, social activities, and historical presentation or exhibition. At the provincial level, sector is represented by historical societies and museums, supported by university centers. But at the national level, the heritage sector for official languages minority communities is one of the last sectors without representation group. For several years now, there has been a growing momentum around heritage activities. Minority population need to strengthen their sense of belonging to their history. For example, the boomer generation feel the need to preserve their memory in order to better transmit it. Several historical societies have been created since 2013 in Alberta, Yukon, and British Columbia, as well as heritage preservation committees in Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Quebec. This momentum is an illustration of the concept of memory vitality proposed by Alain Roy. Indeed, communities are structuring themselves to strengthen their ecosystem in terms of memory and heritage. The goal is to establish a vitality of memory, of collective memory, through multiple community activities and services. As early as 2016, several heritage organizations felt the need to strengthen their collaboration and relationships in order to share knowledge. On March 2021, following a national meeting organized by Librarian Archives Canada, a group of 15 heritage organizations across Canada decided to take official steps toward a national coalition. The issues of stake were multiple: the fragility and isolation of the heritage organizations, the lack of knowledge and expertise, and the absence of reliable representation at the national level. The founding members of the group are organizations decided wholly or partially to heritage. They include historical societies, archives, research centers, heritage networks, community organizations, and national organizations. In addition to representing a diversity of functions, members represent all regions in Canada, including both Francophone and Anglophone minorities. Early on, members adopted the vision of establishing a national organization in the form of network. During the summer and fall of 2021, the group conducted a 17 meeting to establish the foundation of network. A survey was sent to the members to strengthen the direction and the decision making. The mission of the network is mobilize, support, and represent the entities dedicated to the development of the vitality of memory and the influence of the memory, heritage, and historic sector of all MCs in Canada. The network's mandate focus on 3 areas: community of practice, vitality ecosystems, and representation. Initially, the network wishes to encourage collaboration and the sharing of knowledge and tools. The concept of community of practice, raised by Etienne Wenger, seems to us to be an effective way to respond to issues of knowledge and isolation of members. The community of practice is structured around 3 dimensions: a mutual commitment by members to trust openness in order to help each other, a common vision that's created over time by becoming aware of the concerns that bring them together, and the production and sharing of knowledge, resources, and tools that allow members to communicate, find solutions, or examples to follow. Secondly, the network wishes to strengthen their ecosystem that promotes community vitality through heritage actions. This mandate implements mechanisms for the valorization of memory, history preservation, but also research through the structures available in each territory. The goal is not to transform communities, but to encourage an open and integrated perspective of museums, archives, historical societies, and other organizations in each community. Finally, the network also plays a role in mobilizing and representing the heritage sector for all MCs in Canada. The existence and presence of the national voice is intended to awaken public and community authorities to the issues of the sector and to increase the capacities of organizations and institutions in the sector. 2022 is a takeoff year, since the network will be incorporated and will implement a first project. During the summer and fall, a project will be carried out to identify and survey all heritage organizations working for an LMC. At the end of the project, an exact overview of their sectors will be published. So thank you very much for the following presentation. I leave you my contact if you have any questions for any comments. So thank you, merci.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to my presentation, Memory Manifestations of the Edmonton Francophonie, Testing the Memory Vitality Framework. I'm going to begin with an introduction of myself and then a very brief couple of thoughts about the vitality of memory concept and the direction I took on this case study. So Tansé Nisikasan, Rebecca Lazarenko, Osinia, St. Albert, Alberta. I'm Franco-Métis and a graduate student at York University in Toronto. My research focuses on Franco-Métis history in the prairies. More specifically, I am looking at the duality of Francophone communities as targets of English colonization, while also being active colonizers inflicting colonial violence on Métis and other Indigenous nations. When approached to undertake a case study evaluating the concept of vitality of memory and using Edmonton St. Albert's Francophonie as the prime example, I was actually very excited. And although the purpose of the case study was to test the concept and judge the vitality level of the Francophonie in Edmonton and St. Albert, it was really hard for me to not look at the data and see colonialism and its effects on memory and heritage. So in a sense, this case study is also representing duality. I will talk about how I tested the memory concept, and then also I will talk about my analysis and how that relates to colonialism. So I'm going to begin with summarizing methodology, but to start, it's important to know that this research project was completed online due to the pandemic. Therefore, there may be missing data as it is difficult to confirm whether all examples of memory vitality are virtually accessible and documented online. I, however, think that the database is rather comprehensive, as the research benefited from the fact that I grew up in St. Albert and Edmonton, and I have a very strong relationship with the local Francophonie. In that regard, I had a home advantage, I'd say, I guess, of having lived in the communities. So methodologically speaking, the research is divided into 5 categories: the environment, cultural institutions, cultural and social practices, cultural productions, and symbolic dimensions. For this case study, the research exhausted the first category, the environment. More specifically, I searched for all the examples of toponyms and built heritage in Edmonton and St. Albert. Examples of toponyms include neighborhoods, parks, and buildings, while examples of autonyms include roads, avenues, and boulevards. The examples of built heritage include historic neighborhoods, buildings, installations, historical sites or landmarks, archaeological sites, monuments, plaques, public art, and even interpretive panels. To begin the search for examples, I started by identifying fundamentally important websites to use as a starting point. Then the next step was basically a systematic search of all the different paths that were generated by the websites. Then once an example was found and verified, it was added to our database. Once I pursued all the possibilities, I undertook a search that was, I guess I'd say, a bit more random, based on personal knowledge of the cities and even Google Maps at times to capture additional examples that may have been lost. And finally, the database includes many details about the examples, such as their name, category, their type. It also includes things like their origin of dates, location, address, city, a description to whom the example represents, their connection with other examples, notes or supplementary information, their source, and finally a reference. Now to get to the actual exciting part, I'll talk about the results. At this time, the database exemplifies a strong level of vitality of memory found in the Edmonton and St. Albert environment. The database is divided into 2 Excel sheets, toponymy and built heritage. To ensure clarity, I propose the following order of presentation. I will begin with the analysis of the first data set, then I will move to the second data set and conclude with the larger results of the Edmonton St. Albert Francophonie environment analysis. So to begin, the toponymy data set contains 222 examples, 77 from Edmonton and 145 from St. Albert. In Edmonton, there is equal representation among the neighborhoods, parks, buildings, and roads. However, in St. Albert, the examples center on roads and buildings, with only a handful of examples being parks or neighborhoods. In Edmonton, there are 31 neighborhoods, 16 parks, 31 buildings, 9 roads that are named after historic people or French terms in general. In St. Albert, there are 5 neighborhoods, 14 parks, 27 buildings, and 98 roads, principally named after historic people or a pioneer families. The data illustrates a clear difference between the manifestations of heritage in each city. The city of St. Albert honors historic people, such as its founders and pioneer families, which creates a more specific and intimate Francophone memory, whereas the city of Edmonton takes a general approach in honoring its historic people and French language. The memory of Francophone heritage in Edmonton is therefore a bit more subtle, as the French words are now highly anglicized, and their link with the Francophone community is a bit less clear, other than the fact that it's words that are used, or French words. And additionally, regarding numbers, it's quite evident that the city of St. Albert, despite being around 20 times smaller than the city of Edmonton, is contributing significantly more to its heritage. Now, furthermore, there are also other interesting aspects of analysis. Firstly, the analysis reveals that both St. Albert and Edmonton have a toponymy that is principally masculine. There are many French male names, but very little French female names. Within the 222 examples, there are only 18 or 8.1% that represent women. This, however, is not entirely surprising, as most of the examples date back to the 20th century, where the value of women in their work was not necessarily taken into consideration or given full value. In Edmonton, there are 8 examples, 4 buildings that honor Francophone and Métis women, and 3 medical centers named after the Grey Nuns. In St. Albert, there are 10 examples of streets and buildings that honor Francophone and Métis women, and there is also a park that's named after the Grey Nuns. Like Edmonton, the representations of Francophone and Métis women is limited to the education sector and generally the Grey Nuns. However, one nuance for St. Albert is that the names of the Sisters of the Grey Nuns was actually used rather than just the general Grey Nuns or Sacré. Additionally, speaking of representation, the data indicates the toponymy of Edmonton St. Albert actually promotes Francophone colonizers. However, the difference between the two cities is pretty interesting. In Edmonton, there are 77 examples, 63 that represent French Canadians, 7 that represent Métis, 5 that represent French from France, and 2 that represent other French-speaking groups. In St. Albert, there's 145 examples, 94 that represent French Canadians, 21 that jointly represent French Canadian and Métis, 21 that represent French from France, 3 that represent Métis, 2 that represent Belgians, and 4 that represent other French-speaking groups. From this, we can see that the city of St. Albert has invested more resources than the city of Edmonton to ensure that its commemoration of Francophone and Métis heritage is more visible. Finally, it is difficult to talk about dates in this data set, as many examples do not have precise dates of origin specifically for St. Albert. Whereas in the cases where dates are available, they speak to the concept of reconciliation. In Edmonton, there are 7 examples that represent Métis nations, but only 5 of them have dates. There's the new Métis 2021 neighborhood, Thelma Shalifu School 2020, Dakota and North Dakota neighborhoods, respectively 2014, and Garneau neighborhood that was from 1912. The other 2 examples are Garneau School and Garneau Park, where we can estimate that the origin is also in the early 20th century. Therefore there are over 100 years that separate the first and last example representing Métis nations. This, in addition to the negligible number of examples representing Métis nations, indicates that it's not necessarily a priority for the city of Edmonton and its organizations to ensure a visible representation of its Métis heritage. Now, moving on to the second data set, which is built heritage, there are 94 examples, 35 for Edmonton and 59 for St. Albert. In Edmonton, there are 2 neighborhoods, 21 buildings, 1 historical site, 2 public arts, 4 monuments, 4 commemorative plaques, and 1 interpretive panel. In St. Albert, there are 4 neighborhoods, 14 buildings, 1 historical site, 3 monuments, 1 historical walking path, 27 interpretive panels, 7 public art pieces, and 2 others. The buildings, monuments, plaques, and interpretive panels of both cities represent a Francophone heritage that is highly connected to its religious orders, as almost all examples are connected to either the Oblates or the Grey Nuns. And in this case, the examples from both cities are diverse, but the numbers for St. Albert are almost double that of Edmonton. The female representation for built heritage is 8.5%, which also reflects an attachment to education and religious orders. In Edmonton, there are 3 medical centers and 1 public art piece that honor religious orders, specifically nuns, that helped found Alberta, and 1 house, the residence of Eliza Charnier. The female representation in Edmonton is 14.3%. And whereas in St. Albert, there are 4 examples of female representation, 1 interpretive panel, and 3 public art pieces. However, it should be noted that the piece called Star Woman by Stuart Steinhauer, a Cree artist, represents Cree culture and spirituality, which is sometimes but not always shared by Métis nations. So overall, the female representation is 5.1%, with 1.7 representing Cree or Métis women in St. Albert. As with the toponym dataset, the other forms of representation are pretty interesting. In Edmonton, there are 35 examples where 25 represent French Canadians, 5 represent French from France, 3 represent Métis nations, and 1 represents both Métis and French Canadians, with finally 1 other representing French speaking groups. In St. Albert, there's 59 examples, 28 representing Métis, French, and Cree peoples, 11 representing French Canadians, 9 representing Métis and French Canadian, 6 representing Métis and Cree, 3 representing the French from France, 1 representing Métis, French, and French Canadian, and finally 1 representing other French-speaking groups. Considering these numbers, the city of St. Albert has a historical representation that centers and values Métis and Cree people and cultures, a counter to the typical colonial move to whitewash history. However, the same cannot necessarily be said for Edmonton. Then when looking at the dates of the examples in this category, the analysis is also stimulating, and it speaks to physical and visual reconciliation initiatives. In Edmonton's case, there are only 4 modern examples, while the other 31 examples date back to the 20th century. However, none of the 4 modern examples represent Métis nations. They only speak to the Francophone heritage. In contrast, the city of St. Albert has 35 modern examples that center and highlight the contributions of the Francophone community, Métis peoples, and even Cree as well. The city created a founder's walk, which takes visitors on a tour of the city, and it also centers Métis, Cree, and Francophone history. The tour is bolstered by 28 interpretive panels written in English, French, and Cree, and it shares history from 3 perspectives. Due to the pandemic, however, the 3rd and final stage of this initiative was delayed, which just means that there's going to be more examples forthcoming in the near future. There are also 5 public art pieces by Stuart Steinhauer and Dawn and Shirley Begg that center Cree and Métis culture. Additionally, the city created a healing garden meant for its Cree and Métis citizens to use and enjoy as an act of reconciliation. And finally, there's also 1 public art piece that honors the great nuns. As we can see, the city of St. Albert has ensured that its heritage and history is visible and very easily accessible, in addition to featuring all of its founders, and that is not the case for Edmonton. So to provide a general conclusion, overall, the database contains 316 examples of memory vitality in the Francophonie environment of Edmonton and St. Albert, which indicates a very high level of vitality. The historical representation is mainly French Canadian, with 193 examples, closely followed by French from France, with then Métis, French Canadian, Métis by themselves, and then a couple other mixes. Then the representation is also primarily masculine, which means that the contribution of women are undervalued. There are 30 examples that represent women, and among these examples, only 2 represent Métis women and 1 represents Cree women. The data also allowed me to conclude that the level and strength of the memory vitality in Edmonton St. Albert is very high. However, despite being so strong, it is colonial and patriarchal. The examples primarily honor masculine religious figures like Father Albert Lacombe, Father Alexandre Taché, and Archbishop Vital Justin Grandin, and other men who contributed to the economic development of the cities, such as Richard Sécard. However, even though these men are largely recognized as founding fathers of Western Francophonie, we cannot forget or neglect the fact that these men also represent colonial violence and genocide against Indigenous populations. These founding fathers helped found and actively supported residential schools whose purpose was not actually to educate, but rather eliminate or assimilate the Indian problem of white society. Richard Sécard, for example, is a man who was known for his entrepreneurship and business savvy. However, he's also known as a man who cheated and stole script, meaning land, from Métis men and women. Colonial violence is the source of the vitality of Edmonton and St. Albert Francophone memory and heritage. The memory vitality present illustrates that the historic contributions of Métis people and communities are largely ignored or even combined with the contributions of Francophone colonizers. My analysis demonstrates that the city of St. Albert since 2006 has mobilized resources to begin the process of reconciliation with Indigenous populations by decolonizing its history so that Métis and Cree are written in and given value. That is not really the case for the city of Edmonton, but the city is becoming more conscious of the importance and significance of commemorations. For example, the mural dedicated to Archbishop Candin, which glorified and whitewashed residential schools, has been removed, and the new city planning map of Edmonton has neighborhoods that are named after Métis nations and other Indigenous nations. With that said, the analysis allows me to conclude that the cities of Edmonton and St. Albert, meaning their governments, community organizations, specifically Francophone organizations, have a lot of work to do, or even work to continue to completely decolonize their Francophone heritage and memory, to equally honor and value Francophone women, and to allow the contributions of Métis peoples and communities to Western Francophonie to shine. Thank you very much.
Alors, thank you very much, Rebecca, for this last presentation. And this brings us to the question period. So on behalf of everybody that's attended, I want to thank our 4 panelists and our Zoom master, Patrick Latulippe. And I would invite you to stay with us for the next 15 minutes or so and ask your questions. There you go.